The headline lesson that we should take away, if we're going to take one lesson away, is that we were very lucky to avoid nuclear war in 1962.
That's the voice of Dr. Tom Vaughan, lecturer at Aberystwyth University. He's today's guest on Press the Button, a Plowshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now here are your co-hosts, Tom Collina and Lauren Billett.
Thanks, Angela, and welcome back to Press the Button. Lauren, how was your weekend?
Hi, Tom. My weekend was great. I had a nice long weekend spending time with and commemorating Indigenous Peoples Day with my loved ones. And my mom is in town this week, and I really love spending the fall with her. We love the changing leaves. How was your weekend?
That sounds great. I had a nice weekend. It's a nice extended weekend. I didn't go anywhere, stayed around the house. I did go play Frisbee golf for the first time, which is a huge amount of fun for anyone who has not done that. So highly recommend it.
Well, did you win?
We did not keep score. That might have put some people on edge. No, it was just for fun, and it was a lot of fun.
Very diplomatic of you. Well, let's turn to the nuclear world. What updates do you have for us on the nuclear front this week, Tom?
Well, in Ukraine, Russian forces are once again targeting civilians and critical infrastructure after weeks of setbacks on the battlefield. The Russian military hit at least 11 Ukrainian cities with dozens of missiles in its largest aerial assault against civilians since the invasion began. At least 14 people were killed and many more injured, and in all, 11 infrastructure sites were reported hit and power was lost across wide areas of the country. Russian President Putin said the strikes were in retaliation for an explosion that partially destroyed Russia's only bridge to Crimea. The bridge attack was a strategic and symbolic victory for Ukraine, straining one of Russia's main supply lines. But the bridge also happens to be a pet project of Putin's that he personally dedicated in 2018 after Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea. Putin's seemingly desperate but deadly missile strikes have raised concern among Russia's closest allies, India and China, who are calling for de-escalation and dialogue. And Putin's attacks seem likely to lead to additional military supplies for Ukraine from the West, particularly air defenses. Monday's barrage reportedly used more than 80 cruise missiles and drones. Now, Putin's attack appears to have less to do with winning this war in Ukraine and more to do with domestic politics in Russia. These attacks do not seemingly help Russia on the battlefield, and if anything, only increase Ukraine's will to fight. But they do respond to Putin's internal critics who have been pushing for Russia to strike back harder. So ultimately, this seems like a desperate act by Putin and another sign that Russia is losing the war. Unfortunately, the more Russia is losing, the more we have to worry about Putin doing something even worse. President Biden last week said that Putin is not joking when he speaks of using nuclear, biological, or chemical weapons in Ukraine. And Biden said, quote, "We have not faced the prospect of Armageddon since Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis," unquote. John Kirby, the spokesman for the National Security Council, reiterated a day after Biden's warning that the U.S. has not seen signs that Russia is preparing to use nuclear weapons and has no reason to change its nuclear posture. So, one small bit of good news. Lauren, what do you have set up for us on early warning?
This week, Alex Hall spoke with Ester Im, the program manager at the National Committee on North Korea. They discussed North Korea's latest missile launch, the first since 2017, which went over Japan, and speculation that a nuclear test is planned for the coming weeks.
And then I sit down with Dr. Tom Vaughan, a lecturer at Aberystwyth University in Wales. We discuss the upcoming 60th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the lessons we have learned from it and those we have not, and how those lessons are casting a long nuclear shadow over the ongoing crisis in Ukraine.
And if you like what you hear, remember to hit subscribe and leave us a rating. Your feedback helps us to improve the show. And with that, let's get into today's episode. The clock is ticking.
And now, early warning, early warning, early warning, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thanks, Jacqueline. North Korea continues to ramp up its missile tests as it expands its weapons program. The country has launched 6 missiles in the last 2 weeks alone, and this number is expected to rise. In one of the latest tests, North Korea sent an intermediate-range missile over Japan, without warning Tokyo in advance. It has also been speculated that North Korea is preparing to launch its first nuclear test since 2017. To help us understand the situation, today we are joined by Ester Im, the program manager at the National Committee on North Korea. Welcome, Esther.
Thanks so much for having me, Alex.
Why do you think we are seeing a ramping up of tests this past week, and what was particularly significant about these latest provocations from North Korea?
Thanks. I think the recent activity is a function of two major things. First, a fulfillment of North Korean strategic priorities, and second, a political message and show of resolve from North Korea. In the aftermath of the failure of US-North Korea negotiations, North Korea announced a 5-year plan for renewed missile and nuclear weapons development and reversed a self-imposed moratorium on testing, which it had undertaken unilaterally during negotiations with the Trump administration. And true to this commitment, North Korea has been testing at a rapid clip, with nearly 40 missile launches this year alone. And for context, North Korea launched 25 missiles in 2017, which was the last record-setting year of tests for North Korea. So I think it's important to recognize and view that these tests fit within a pattern of development by North Korea in line with Kim Jong-un's 5-year plan and his strategic priorities. At the same time, I think it's clear that there is some correlation between the timing of these launches and developments in the region, that they're serving a political message. US Vice President Kamala Harris was just in Seoul last week, and US and South Korea wrapped up its largest annual joint military exercises at the beginning of this month. Also, the US and South Korea and Japan conducted a joint anti-submarine exercise for the first time in nearly 5 years, which included the US aircraft carrier and destroyer, the US Ronald Reagan. This intermediate range missile launch over Japan in particular seems to be a response to this trilateral exercise. For longer range missiles, North Korea has generally lofted its missile trajectory so that it does not fall over territory and lands in water between North Korea and Japan. Launching across Japan is a clear choice and one designed, I think, to send a message and show North Korea's protest over these exercises, which it has always viewed as hostile and has been loud and forceful in its reactions to them. Finally, and I know I said two things, but I think we know that things are hardly black and white. And we also have to view North Korea's actions within the broader geostrategic context. I think North Korea sees a good window for rapid development as Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the US-China competition pushes North Korea down the priority list and is less likely to draw broader consequences from the international community. And later we can talk a little bit also about kind of the inter-Korea relations and how that dynamic is also contributing to greater tensions and drawing some of these reactions from North Korea.
So on that note, do you see the reaction from the US, Japan, and South Korea to this most recent escalation as something that could further provoke North Korea and kind of outline there that dynamic between North and South that you mentioned?
Immediate response to these launches, the US and South Korea responded with a show of force by launching missiles and warplane exercises just to show precision airstrike capabilities. And the United States and South Korea and Japan also conducted an additional trilateral military exercise, which featured warships from each country. And the US Ronald Reagan, which had just left those trilateral exercises that happened earlier last week, made a rare and quick redeployment to the peninsula to show resolve and readiness. And I think this reaction aligns with a broader pattern of response, especially from the United States and South Korea. Since a new and conservative government has come into power in South Korea, the United States and South Korea have really recentered the alliance on the military alliance and has conducted more robust joint military exercises, which were paused under the Moon administration and also because of COVID. And they've also resumed more kind of pointed demonstrations of force in response. The United States and South Korea responding to each test with their own missile launches and warplane exercises. And South Korea has also been publicly emphasizing military planning for what they call the kill chain and massive punishment and retaliation systems, which are designed to preemptively counter North Korean nuclear attacks and to strike North Korean leadership targets, which, as you can imagine, is drawing a very critical response from North Korea. And some analysts have warned that these preemptive strategies also may ultimately be ineffective given developments in North Korea's nuclear program and may only contribute to escalation. So kind of in other words, as South Korea takes a harder stance, North Korea also has to take a harder stance. And that's not necessarily to say that each is justified, but just to kind of point out that reality. And, aside from these military responses, efforts to address the recent provocations at the UN Security Council have also been stymied by China and Russia. These ballistic missile launches are a clear violation of UN Security Council resolutions, and yet the Council has not been able to take any meaningful steps towards sanctioning North Korea or even officially condemning the violations, which is concerning and perhaps teaching North Korea that it can continue to engage in these actions without consequences. So all sides are digging in, and I think we may witness an escalatory cycle that will be difficult to break. And the test really will be how to balance a deterrence and show of resolve with risk reduction and crisis management. And I don't think enough attention is being paid to the latter.
So speaking of crisis escalation, reports are also speculating that North Korea is planning to conduct a nuclear weapons test in the coming weeks or months. How likely do you think this is, given what you just outlined?
I think a North Korean nuclear test is inevitable. Given the 5-year plan that we discussed, there are strong technical drivers for nuclear testing for North Korea. And I think most everyone in the North Korea policy community is quite in consensus that a test is likely. And, commercial satellite imagery and statements from US intelligence officials also suggest that North Korea has completed preparations for a 7th nuclear test. And so now it's just all about when. I think it's possible that North Korea is using these recent launches to show how much it can get away with and is deciding what would be the best moment for such a nuclear test. There was some speculation that North Korea would refrain from provocative behavior before China's Party Congress. Party Congress, in deference to its strategic partner, who North Korea depends on for economic aid. So the long-range missile tests were a little bit of a surprise. The Party Congress is set to take place October 16th. So I think we won't know till we know, but I would assume perhaps after. In the end, I think things will get worse before they get better. There's very little appetite for all sides for negotiations. And I think the tests are certainly a show from North Korea that it doesn't have any appetite for negotiations. And we're really getting further and further from any prospects for denuclearization. And certainly the costs of negotiating on that are getting higher. But I don't think that means that we should give up on those goals, and that we should be thinking of what other proactive measures we could take towards risk reduction and diplomatic engagement.
Thank you so much, Esther. We'll definitely be watching this closely, and best of luck in all your work.
Thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Jacqueline Shing, the Communications and Marketing Specialist at Plowshares Fund. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has exposed just how close nuclear escalation and nuclear war can be. To meet the urgency of this moment, Plowshares Fund has launched a donation match challenge to make the largest grants possible to those who are working every day to reduce and eliminate nuclear weapons. Right now, all first-time gifts will be matched dollar for dollar, and all new monthly gifts will be matched at their 12-month value. Or increase your giving and the full amount above your last gift will be matched. Go to plowshares.org/donate today. And thanks for listening.
"60 years ago this month, the United States and the Soviet Union came dangerously close to nuclear war. Soviet leader Khrushchev had secretly sent nuclear-capable missiles to Cuba, and once they were discovered, U.S. President Kennedy demanded that Khrushchev take them out. For 13 long days, the world teetered on the nuclear brink. Well, here we go again. In Ukraine, Russia has seized land and is threatening to defend it with nuclear weapons. Ukraine, with U.S. support, is mobilizing to push Russia out. Once again, we are facing nuclear catastrophe and wondering who will blink first. So it's worth asking the question, how did we get here again? Did we learn nothing from the Cuban Missile Crisis, or did we just learn the wrong things? Today we are joined by Dr. Tom Vaughan, lecturer at Aberystwyth University, and he recently wrote a terrific article called Nuclear War: Does it take luck or reasoning to avoid it? Lessons from the Cuban Missile Crisis 60 years on. Tom, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm very much looking forward to talking with you.
So, the Cuban Missile Crisis is widely regarded as the closest we have come to nuclear disaster. So, if you could, take us back to October 1962 and remind us how we got so close to nuclear war and how did we avoid it?
Sure. So I'll give you a very brief potted history. So on October 14th, 1962, US spy plane captures photographs of Soviet missile launch sites being constructed in Cuba. Missiles launched from Cuba would be within range of much of the US mainland. And so in response, US President John F. Kennedy imposes a naval blockade of Cuba on the 22nd of October, intended to prevent further Soviet nuclear weapons reaching Cuba. And Kennedy demands that Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev remove the weapons. Khrushchev refuses. And so over the days that follow, we see that the two leaders trading very public demands and private appeals as well, urging each other to back down, being in constant communication between the two of them and their teams, urgently trying to decipher the other's motives and find opportunities for negotiation. On the 26th of October, Cuban Prime Minister Fidel Castro actually writes to Khrushchev asking him to attack the US in a preemptive strike to prevent an invasion of Cuba. And thankfully, Khrushchev refuses. Then on the 27th of October, Soviet anti-aircraft missiles shoot down the US spy plane over Cuba. And this really brings tensions to a fever pitch. So realizing that war is imminent, Kennedy and Khrushchev begin to offer concessions. Kennedy agrees to remove US intermediate range nuclear missiles from Turkey, which are within range of the Soviet Union. And in return, Khrushchev agrees to remove the offending Soviet missiles in Cuba if the US promises not to invade Cuba afterwards. And by October the 28th, the crisis is winding down. And I think it's really important to highlight that during this period, there is really an acute global sense of crisis. And if you read first-hand reports of people sort of living their ordinary lives at this time, a lot of them are essentially saying that they believe the world is about to end. So regardless of events on the ground between the leaders, it really is a period of acute fear.
Thank you very much for that overview. And I have to say, the Cuban Missile Crisis is one of the most written about examples of nuclear crisis. And people honestly disagree, right, about what the main lessons are. Did it show that, we just got lucky? Did it show that deterrence works? As they say, you can find a lawyer for any position. In this case, you could find an international relations expert for any position you want here. But give us your view. What are the core lessons from this crisis?
So I think in a very crude summary, right, the headline lesson that we should take away, if we're going to take one lesson away, is that we were very lucky to avoid nuclear war in 1962. And at the absolute height of the crisis, there were two very lucky events that we can focus on that could have otherwise led to war if things had gone different. My colleague Benoit Pelopidas in France, he's got some really important insights on these events and these lessons, and I recommend his work. And Ned Lebo's recently surveyed these events and their interpretations, how they've been looked at in the literature. So the first one is the Okinawa Incident. So on the 27th of October, 1962, the 873rd Tactical Missile Squadron in Okinawa receives a launch order by mistake from Strategic Air Command to launch 32 missiles at Soviet and Chinese targets. So this would have been 35 megatons worth of nuclear weapons. This is a valid order. The codes in the launch order from SAC match the codes held in sealed envelopes by the officers on the base. So this generally looked to them like the start of a nuclear war. And the story goes essentially that a captain on the base realizes that the order must be invalid because Strategic Air Command was at DEFCON 3 at that time, and you need to be at DEFCON 1 for an order like this to be issued. And he convinced the officers to stand down until they managed to finally get confirmation from the mainland that the order was rescinded. And it's important to note here actually that there are some personnel on the base who since then have disputed this account of events. So it's still a little bit murky. But there is another incident that we do have confirmed, which happened around the same time at the height of the crisis. And it's the Soviet submarine B-59. So the sub is in the Caribbean, it's close to Cuba. It's being harassed by US anti-submarine aircraft and ships. And the sub's captain concludes the nuclear war has broken out. And he decides to dive and to fire his nuclear-tipped torpedo. And so the captain, who's concluded that war has broken out, his name's Savitsky, he tries to descend to the torpedo room. But the navigation officer gets stuck in the conning tower, blocking his way. And this gives another one of the captains on the ship, who was convinced it was a mistake, time to talk him round. And again, if a nuclear torpedo had been fired here, there's a really good chance that this would have sparked off an uncontrollable escalation. And we have to remember as well, just even without these, the context of heightened tensions and hair trigger alerts is really dangerous. So despite this, I think there are some really optimistic and complacent lessons that have been learned. And what you learn from this really depends largely on your pre-existing kind of point of view. So you will have some who believe in the essential tenets of deterrence theory, that it's a stabilizing force, concluding that, well, there was no war, and this further proves that nuclear weapons serve peace, either from an existential point of view, as in both sides are sufficiently scared that they want to avoid war, or from the point of view that the US's superiority scares off the Soviets. And these arguments really reaffirm the essential value of nuclear weapons in stopping war, which is obviously a very strange conclusion, given the fact that the entire crisis is kicked off by nuclear weapons in the first place. And of course, a related argument here is the long peace theory of the Cold War that comes from Gaddis, John Lewis Gaddis, who's hugely controversial, and this is really rooted in the same biases. Now, if you're more of an institutionalist or a non-proliferator who perhaps doesn't like nuclear weapons, but you nonetheless accept the necessity of their place in US strategy, you might argue that, well, okay, this was a very dangerous situation, but it's helped us to learn how to avoid it in the future by institutionalizing some regimes, some communication arrangements that should make this kind of confrontation, if not impossible, then at least unlikely.
Thanks so much. So let me ask you, what of those lessons do you think we have most internalized? Which ones have we learned? Or have we learned other lessons that may or may not be so useful in confronting future conflicts?
One variety of lesson is the kind of deterrence lesson. And the second kind of lesson, I think, is this argument about nuclear learning. And we learn this from Cuba. Well, according to various kind of institutionalist theorists, we take these conclusions from Cuba and from other close calls during the Cold War too. The lesson there is, so apparently the argument goes that the experience of nuclear danger and near misses drives leaders and states to kind of institutionalize these arrangements. So you have, to stop things happening again. So you have at the international level arms control agreements, you see strengthening norms of nuclear non-use, you see improvements in communications between nuclear powers, and you see domestically as well, people in the nuclear bureaucracies learn how to better live with the weapons and make sure they're kind of not going to lose control of them. And so the general conclusion from this is essentially that, something like the Cuban Missile Crisis couldn't happen again in the same way. Nuclear weapons might still be dangerous, but we're safer because of the development of these regimes and institutions. But I think we only have to look at Ukraine to see that the kind of learning that we'd like to see there hasn't happened, or at least it's not enough. We see Russia is really focusing in this crisis on battlefield nuclear weapons. These are what's driving the current crisis, and they're really destabilizing. We should also note that the US is also very interested in updating its battlefield and sub-strategic nuclear arsenal too. If you'd learned from nuclear danger in the past, why would you be doing this? And the second point is that there were still plenty of near misses that we know about, and who knows what other ones we don't know about. After Cuba, you had Exercise Able Archer in 1983, and in 1995, even after the Cold War, Russia mistakes the US research rocket from Norway for a missile launch. And Yeltsin had to make the final call as to whether or not to respond with a retaliatory attack. So the idea that nuclear learning has kind of occasioned from these crises sufficiently to divert them in the future, I think is really flawed. And there may be some improvements, but ultimately we're still at the mercy of luck. And I think the danger is that we take an illusion of safety from these improvements that have been made.
And when you say illusion of safety, talk more about that somehow the years that have gone by without war is teaching people that war is not possible, and that the institutions we build contribute to that?
I think so, yeah. I think what I mean by illusion of safety is if we have these narratives that tell us, we avoided nuclear war then, so it's unlikely now, or, now we have these various arrangements in place that make it less likely. It encourages us to really kind of forget the danger that's posed by nuclear weapons on a day-to-day basis. And it allows us to kind of have them fade into the background. If you accept the kind of basic tenets of deterrence theory as well, we kind of accept that, for now, this is good enough to keep nuclear danger at bay. And of course, it's only when you've reached with a crisis like Ukraine that suddenly it all comes roaring back. We're not forgetting anymore. And suddenly we're thinking, 60 years after Cuba, well, how have we got to this stage? And it's, of course, because we haven't learned how to, the right lessons from Cuba, which is that, these weapons are incredibly dangerous and this kind of instability will always be with us, as long as they are here.
Let's talk about Ukraine a bit. How would you compare the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Ukraine crisis today, and how would you apply the lessons of the past?
So I think there's plenty of differences, obviously. Some might argue that the nature of the nuclear standoff is maybe less severe. So we don't have a direct confrontation between US and Russian forces. At the moment, there's no credible sign that Russian nuclear forces have been placed on high alert or are being ready for use. There's also an argument, which I saw Hamish to Breton Gordon, who's a former British nuclear response commander. He said this in an interview recently with CNN, that we're not looking at a strategic confrontation, and what's at stake is the use of battlefield or tactical nuclear weapons. And he thinks that the prospect of escalation to strategic conflicts, the use of ICBMs and such, is low, and that even if Russia were to employ these weapons, the conventional response could de-escalate. Now, of course, there are other things, on the flip side that look like they make it way more dangerous. We have an active, hot war in Ukraine. There's bullets and shells flying. Already, that's dangerous in itself. We have an incredibly complex and sprawling information environment compared to 1962. There's a lot of confusion. There's a lot of noise on social media, for example, and leaders are perhaps more subject to the kind of immediate whims of public pressure to act in one way or another. I was really concerned this year, earlier in the year, about the kind of popular calls on social media for a no-fly zone in Ukraine, for example. There seemed to be very little public understanding of what that would entail. And also, this confrontation, one way or another, has been going on for nearly 8 months. Cuba was over in a couple of weeks, but as long as this war drags on, we're in a state of heightened danger. And finally, this is why I really disagree with Hamish de Breton Gordon. The fact that we're talking about so-called battlefield nuclear weapons is really dangerous. There seems to be a perception in Russia, but also I would wager within NATO, that these weapons are less escalatory and therefore more usable without sparking for full-scale war. Drawing a hard line between these weapons and strategic weapons is really a fallacy. Some tactical weapons have a yield of up to 50 kilotons. On the ground, try distinguishing that from a strategic weapon. And some strategic weapons themselves have variable yields, so you can employ them as a lower yield battlefield weapon, themselves. So I think the distinction in terms of the escalatory potential is really meaningless. And the danger here is that Putin might calculate that he can use a smaller battlefield nuclear weapon without provoking a Western nuclear response because of the kind of non-strategic nature of these weapons. Would we in the West see that as fundamentally different to the use of a strategic weapon? I wouldn't personally want to bet on that.
Completely agree. I've been very worried about a lot of the media discussion of, so-called tactical nuclear weapons as small, right? Not even relatively small, just small. And I think that is misleading and quite dangerous. Let's talk a little bit more about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Back in the day, President Kennedy and Khrushchev held secret communications that played arguably an important role in bringing the crisis to a peaceful conclusion. Do you see any prospects of current U.S. and Russian leaders engaging in those kind of secret back-channel talks?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's obvious that there is ongoing communication to some extent between the highest levels of the US government and NATO and the Kremlin. Of course, we don't know what's being said or how intense that communication is. But the metaphorical, big red phone on the president's desk is certainly in use, I think. We saw Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, the other day allude to this a few days ago when he said the US had directly communicated to Russia specifically what it would do if Russia resorted to battlefield nuclear weapons. And I don't know what this would be. Now, of course, in one sense, this is encouraging. Some communication is definitely better than none. But even notwithstanding this really different information environment that we're in now, I think, compared to 1962, this line of dialogue that we have still shares some of the fundamental limitations that were present during 1962 as well. Risk-based, game-based views of strategy suggest that leaders and their advisors can kind of calculate with some degree of accuracy what their adversaries are likely to do. Ned Lebo writes in a recent piece that, even though Kennedy and Khrushchev had a direct line of communication, they would constantly misunderstand each other. They misinterpreted one another's perceptions of risk. They didn't fully comprehend the broader context in which the other was operating. And frequently, at different points in the conflict as well, they were unaware of key developments and actions that were being taken by subordinate commanders. So even though there's this direct communications link, you still have all of these unknowns and these potentials for misunderstanding. And the current conflict is complicated in a way because so much of this war is taking place in the information sphere as well. So with so much noise, you have to really imagine that it's very difficult to divine your opponent's intentions. And we're all really aware, I think, of how difficult Western analysts have found it to figure out exactly what goes on in the Kremlin. We've had so much speculation about Putin, the way he thinks, the state of his health, that he's gone insane, whatever. The prospect for misunderstanding and misperception then, I think, is really big there. And like in Cuba, there's no guarantee that any mistakes are going to be resolved peacefully.
Now, you write in your article that nuclear war is inevitable over a long period of time. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, this is a point that a guy called Matthew Rendell has recently made in an article where he describes nuclear war as a predictable surprise. And it's a really simple argument. As long as nuclear weapons exist, the probability of a nuclear detonation, of course, a full-scale war, is above zero. We can't quantify that as risk because it's uncertain, but we know it's a non-zero probability. And even if the likelihood in a given year or a given few years is low, year upon year, we approach a probability of 1. And the real tragedy of this problem, I think, is that it incentivizes us to leave the hard work of fixing these problems to the next generation. If we think the chances of nuclear war are low in a given cycle of government, a given decade, we can shift these costs into the future and we defer action. And I think this leads us to what is often called nuclear forgetting. These fears fade into the background and we come to accept nuclear deterrence as good enough for now. It keeps the chance of war low enough on a given year to keep us muddling through until one day it happens, right? Unfortunately, Matthew Rendell gives us some solutions to this conundrum, which I can't agree with. He suggests that we rely on non-proliferation and arms control to buy time until either nuclear weapons become obsolete or humanity moves to other planets. And I don't think either of these are things that we can really rely on. And I think that if we do eventually leave Earth, I think it's fairly certain that nuclear weapons will follow us before long. So I think the only thing that we can really do to reliably bring that chance of nuclear war down to zero is work towards the abolition of nuclear weapons and so forth.
And on that point, you write in your article that the existence of nuclear weapons always invites catastrophe, which I think is very well said. If we're lucky enough to get through the Ukraine crisis, what do you think we need to do to ensure that we're not back here in another 60 years? How do we get on a different path?
Yeah, so in one sense, and of course not to diminish at all the human tragedy and the brutality of Russia's war in Ukraine, there's a sense in which we've been jolted out of the nuclear forgetting that we've had since the end of the Cold War. And I think it's an opportunity to look back at the crisis and realise that the lessons we learned from that and from the Cold War in general have helped to bring us back to the brink. And this is going to keep happening unless we learn some different lessons. One of the things that happened with Cuba, the instances of luck that I described earlier, the near misses, they didn't appear in the official narratives of the crisis or popular narratives even until much later. They were hidden, they were uncovered through research and investigation. And there's a good chance that, assuming we avoid escalation in Ukraine, the same thing is going to happen again. So just because we don't hear about any near misses after this is all over, we shouldn't assume they didn't happen. And in the meantime, we have Cuba as a cautionary tale. Now, in terms of a bigger response, what do we do about this? I think it's very, very challenging. And I'm going to give you an academic's answer, unfortunately. On one hand, a nuclear crisis like this needs to be the catalyst to start bringing about serious soul searching about how do we get out of this nuclear danger. But as far as I can see, the wrong lessons being learned again. You have NATO reaffirming the importance of nuclear weapons in its most recent strategic concept. You have leaders trumpeting the nuclear umbrella, and you have public opinion in Europe becoming more and not less favourable towards nuclear weapons. In the short term, though, you have groups like the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, reaching critical well, and of course ploughshares, who are advancing the case against nuclear weapons and in favour of the ban treaty. And these are all really important contributions, important voices in the immediate wake of this crisis. And we need somebody to make that argument, in particular the argument that this invasion was made possible by Russia's possession of nuclear weapons and their implicit threat in the first place. But more broadly, though, my concern is that I think the ban treaty campaign lacks a fundamentally different, complete vision of what a disarmed world looks like and how we get there from the point we're currently at. It makes the moral argument, the humanitarian argument, very, very well. But I do think we have to acknowledge that we're faced with these structural materially embedded influences of deterrence theory, the material reality of nuclear weapons, their inherent destructive power. We can't wish those away. And I think we're still lacking an account of how do we break out of these tragic structures of deterrence? How do we go about reconfiguring global politics and the logics that kind of permit and encourage nuclear possession in the first place? And I think crises like Cuba and Ukraine are potentially ruptures that give us a small opportunity, right, to advance visions of the future where we aren't menaced by nuclear weapons. And unfortunately, I don't think we currently have that kind of vision of such a future and how we get to that future that's ready to go, that we can sell to the global public when these crises happen. So I think building these futures, thinking through achievable visions of disarmament in our time, I think this is the most important project. And this is what I'm working on. So in a sense, I would say what I'm arguing for is pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will, as Gramsci would say. I think we need to think really big. We need to push the boundaries of possibility. It's obviously not a fashionable time to be a utopian in any sense. But on the other hand, I think utopian thinking is, for me, the only hope that we have of completely removing nuclear danger. And I think really anything else is just a Band-Aid.
Tom, thank you so much for talking with us, and best of luck in all your work.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced and edited in Washington, D.C. by Lauren Billett, Angela Kellett, and Alex Hall. Audio engineering in San Francisco by Jacqueline Shing. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org